Larry stood in his office in front of the latest digital version, what he used to call a whiteboard, as he continued to go over the classes to make sure that he was covering everything along with all the material needed for the new species that came in. He continually asked for more input from his new associate. Every time he turned around, it was difficult for his eyes not to move in certain directions as Cindy sat there still in very suggestive attire. He more than once asked her to put something else on, but she insisted since there was no such thing as a dress code in that school, considering that many species don't wear clothing at all, her look could be considered conservative by many. So she just had to go with it. With that, Larry kept turning away and making sure he was not staring down towards her, as every time she was leaned over to take notes, he could definitely see down that outfit of hers, which made things difficult to focus at times. Along with that, every time she walked away, his eyes would immediately do what men do, and he was having difficulty still focusing. He wanted to keep his mind on his work, and thankfully, for him, Greknar and his children had arrived. They had actually shown up to bring him lunch, knowing that he had been working really hard to make sure everything was set up for the new species in his classes. Along with that, as the kids ran in, they immediately went up and "Daddy!" and went up and hugged him. With that, his young daughter immediately ran up and jumped into his arms. It's amazing how high she can actually jump. The strength in her legs cannot be underestimated, at least, as she jumped up and knocked him almost over into the whiteboard itself. His son, however, ran up, gave him a hug, and they both shared a handshake after a quick hug to say, "Hey, how you doing?" Gregnar simply walked in, being happy to see what was going on. She was happy to have that family of hers. She knew this was as good as life ever gets, and she wasn't going to spoil it. Larry looked over and could see her walking up with the food in her hands, and he liked the way she was dressed. Much more conservative, though with a slight bit of suggestiveness in it. She was dressed ladylike, of course, but that long dress she was in was very thin. In fact, so thin that if you look close at certain times, you could actually see certain things poking out, or certain things that are, well, different colors and easy to be seen. In particular, that white thong she was wearing under the white dress was very clear to see every time the fabric pushed against it. What made it more appealing was the fact that Greknar's tail made it impossible for her to wear the standard type of undergarments. They had to be custom made with strange loops that made the idea of a whale tail very, very clear. Along with that, it was normal for a forced not to wear much clothing at all, so the idea of her wearing a brassiere was almost insulting, being as constrictive as it was. Thankfully, the kids were not dressed in any way, shape, or form suggestive, being that they're only 7 years old. Thankfully, the kids were both wearing t-shirts and had their own version of black denim on their trousers, so everything was okay there. They looked at each other, and Gregnar simply stated how she had brought lunch. And of course, Larry was grateful for this as he lowered his daughter onto the ground. This was not easy, considering Shreknar's long tail naturally would wrap around him on the way there. With that, as they sat and ate, Shreknar brought up the fact that she went by Sherry now by her friends, her human companions. Larry was actually surprised at this, although not fully surprised. Gregnar was a little put back at this and wanted him to correct her and let her know that her whole name was Shreknar and she shouldn't change it. Larry had to remind her that this was a human thing. In fact, he was about to shorten her name if she didn't take so much offense to it, to make it simply easier to say. But Sherry was a very common name back on Earth. And this, of course, made Shreknar actually happy. In fact, her tail began to wag a little bit at the idea of this. She realized that because they gave her a human name, she was being accepted more by the full-blood humans that were around the area. John spoke up and asked, "So, what were you going to change Mommy's name to?" With that, he looked at Gretnar, and she had just daggers in her eyes, as she basically said with her eyes, "Don't you even say it." Larry simply grinned a little bit and said, "Don't worry about it." As they continued talking, John was looking at Cindy, He was unconsciously wagging his tail as he began to examine her body closer and closer. Eventually, Cindy noticed this and made a few suggestive comments. Those did not go over well with Gregnar, as she was still a bit jealous of Cindy's proportions and was worried that if she couldn't steal Gregnar's husband, maybe she was going after her son. Cindy simply said, "Don't worry, he's still too young for now, but I can tell he's going to be a strong, handsome young man. I'm looking forward to that." She stopped halfway as Gregnar again shot her daggers across the floor. But in this case, it wasn't just because she was angry. It was also for the fact that Larry decided to calm things down a little bit and change it as he slowly put his hand under his wife's dress and began to rub her leg, bringing his arm around the back so that no one could see that the fabric was raising up. He simply continued to do so. This seemed to calm Gretnar down a bit more, especially since she turned over and looked at him and he had that sly grin of, "You wait till tonight." While this was going on, Sherry actually asked Cindy about why her outfit was the way it is, why it was pushing certain proportions the way it was. And Cindy looked and sat down and said, "Well, let me just tell you what happened with me, and you'll fully understand." She began to talk about how when she was growing up, she was considered unattractive. At least she believed so. And because of that, she spent most of her early life studying. So much so that she didn't actually spend a lot of time with people. She stopped at this point and said, "It's a very good thing that you have friends. Social skills are very difficult to learn, and it's best that you learn them now." With this, Sherry was actually so happy that again she moved her tail in a way that showed that she was happy with the comments that was given to her. Cindy continued with, "You see, I was actually an old woman by the time we had actually got a hold of what we call CRISPR technology, the ability to turn me into this." She said this as she flapped her wings a little bit and waved her tail. In fact, she waved her tail around so much that she actually bumped John a little bit with it, excusing herself a little bit and then continuing. "You see, this was that was about 20 years that we had gotten the option to actually adjust ourselves. I waited for a long time because I wanted to see what was going on. During that time, believe it or not, the majority of folks, especially in a certain part of our world, loved this look." She waved over at Gregnar, as Gregnar was trying desperately to keep herself steady from the fact that the fingers were still waving up and down her thigh, though by now she had actually sat down on Larry's lap as so to conceal what he was doing. Both John and Sherry were confused, and they did look confused, and then Cindy continued, "You see, this was sort of we used to call it a trope. If you see a lot of your vid shows where certain things always seem to happen, everyone wants a certain thing to happen, that's what's called a trope. But because of that, the idea of a cat girl," she waved her hand in the quote signal for that, "was considered to be very, very attractive. In fact, an extreme percentage of women decide to do this. But the problem is the CRISPR technology that we had was very permanent at the time. There was no adjusting from it. Even those that adjusted themselves first just found out they might have made a mistake, and then they couldn't change back. There was a major problem with this, as many of the girls didn't want to be the cat girls anymore, and it made them do bad things to themselves." She looked over at Larry and he just simply nodded. "Don't continue. Just don't." Before changing the subject, she did actually put in the fact that, well, things have actually changed recently. And why? She's sitting right there with your daddy. They both looked over at their mother with her long red hair and those piercing green eyes of hers, and the very shapely body that she had that was very fit. They both looked and they were a bit confused, but they simply added, "Don't worry, you're young, you'll get it eventually. It's not something you're supposed to understand yet." However, what's common now is simply enhancements and age regression, and of course, the good old brain tune up. They both looked at each other. Brain tune-up? John asked. Oh, yes. You see, that works with cybernetics. I don't think your dad has actually shown you how one of our ships operates. It actually links in through the mind through a CNI, a cranial neural interface. We can actually think our way through space. It's very interesting. It used to be science fiction, but in actuality, it's very simple to do, at least now. Back before we had certain programs, that was limited to. She paused as she realized that Larry was shooting her a glare again of don't continue with that. That is not something they need to know. Don't worry about that. Let's just understand that most things that happen now are people trying to make themselves seem the best they possibly can. Now there's obvious limits, of course. And most people don't want to be 8, 12 feet tall. I mean, look at your daddy. He stands at what's considered 6'3", but he said specifically to me he doesn't want to get any larger, do you? Larry shook his head and then turned to his wife and said, Would you like me to be larger? Gregnar simply turned with a shocked look on her face as she realized what he was thinking about and said, Absolutely not. It didn't take long after that the kids to start asking how they can be adjusted. They started looking at their bodies in reflections to see what they could do. Of course, Sherry wanted to get more mature and John wanted to be stronger, but they had to be reminded of a simple fact. It is not authorized to allow anyone that is not matured to be adjusted. The only thing they can do is fix you. The kids were confused. What do you mean fixed? Oh, well, if you rip something off or one of your organs isn't working right, we can replace those. We can fix you. But you can't do anything like this, she said as she waved her wings out as wide as they could go, which honestly wasn't very large. Why is that? John asked. Oh, it's too dangerous, Cindy replied. It's very dangerous because we don't know how the body is going to readjust itself as you're growing. You see, there's a lot of different chemicals that go through your body when you're maturing. Some of them can be unpredictable. And because of that, you might end up growing extra organs or losing portions of yourself. And then trying to fix someone now is going to be much more difficult and much more expensive. Gregnar jumps in and reminds them how she was fully grown, fully matured physically when she entered the academy. Main reason is that the forced tend to mature very quickly. Being a warrior culture, it's kind of a requirement. However, she did bring up the fact that her friend Femcast, which both of the kids remembered and recognized, said that she had to wait. She actually had to wait longer, even though she wanted to be adjusted first. She couldn't because she was not done growing. She had not fully matured in her physical body before they could actually do any adjustments. Not to mention, Femcast was more of a, well, she was a beta test. They had worked out most of the kinks, but then again, they hadn't adjusted many of the Nishani at all. They had helped them grow back a couple of limbs, but that was about it. Sherry was upset about this, as she definitely wanted to have more proportions and some pretty wings and all sorts of fun stuff that she started to complain about. John, on the other hand, was simply contemplating the idea, wondering what he should do, looking at his arms and legs, tapping on his stomach a little bit, wondering what he should do later. While their minds were off in the corner, there was an odd, strange, light snap noise that went over. This, of course, made Gregnar lift her head up a little bit and seem almost shocked and almost nervous at the idea. Nobody except the adults realized that Larry had just snapped her undergarments and kind of hinted at certain ideas, so they immediately changed the subject. They brought up to the kids that this would be the first time that two flight-capable species are going to do a challenge. The kids were confused. They didn't even know there was two flight-capable species. They had just barely heard about the Arkeytens and were confused that there was another. They had to be informed that the Zucknackel had started to adjust themselves and started to give themselves wings. And it seems like they wanted to test them out. They wanted to see what they were like, and Larry immediately brought up a holographic display of both species. They were surprised at this. They saw that the Arkeytens was much more avian. They had, of course, feathers, and he showed the difference between the males and the females, especially when it came to plumage. It was pretty obvious that the males were much more flamboyant in the amount of color they had in their feathers and decorative beards and things of that nature, where most of the females were very, very subdued. They hinted at the idea of women always being more conservative, although this went over like a fart in church when they looked over and Cindy had a look of, stop saying shit like that, in her eyes. Along with that, they looked at the Zucknackel and saw that the skinny reptilian species had begun to grow wings. They also began to make themselves larger. Why? Because they wanted to. It was clear that they were in their alpha and beta testing when it came to their genetic adjustments. However, they didn't know how it was going to be. Everyone, everyone was confused about this, as the Zucknackel had just started to learn how to use their wings correctly. In fact, it was the Arkeytens that were the ones who were teaching them. So why this challenge? Nobody really knew. The only thing they did know is that it was going to take place in the skies, not just in the trees, not just near a river, not just near an ocean or something, not even inside the Mount City, the movement on urban terrain area. No, this would be fought in the air, but it was going to be strange. Everybody knew because the weapons being used. They were authorized to use not only the paint rifles, but also a type of pistol if they wanted it, which most people didn't carry as the range was terrible in comparison to the rifle. But also they were going to be able to use shock batons. Why? Usually hand-to-hand combat is forbidden in the arena. However, it does happen on a semi-regular basis. Most people just put a blind eye to it. So they figured, hey, why the hell not? Hearing this, the kids wanted to watch the match, but had to be told that it was going to be another 2 days away. Pretty soon the conversation faded, and Greknar took the kids and was heading back out. After they left, Cindy and Larry continued to talk about the next class, which they would have to hurry up to get to. But before they left, Cindy did have to ask one question. Why the hell would you feel up and basically finger bang your wife in the office when your kids are around? They didn't notice. Well, still, what? Seriously, what are you doing? You talk about her dressing modestly and you do that. Why? Foreplay, he stated. Cindy was a little confused. But you asked why she. What the. But you make her dress so modestly? I mean, for a forced. It's like she's wearing a nun's outfit. And yet you're doing that. I don't get it. Why would you do that? Just foreplay? Yeah. But don't you have anything else to say? Well, it goes to the old phrase. I mean, you're old school like me, or at least you should be. You remember the old phrase. Which one? Larry tried to hide that sly grin as he said, Lady on the streets? Freak in the sheets. Then he turned and said, let's get back to work. 2 days later, everyone was getting ready for the beginning challenge in the arena. Everyone was very interested to see how things were going to play out. In fact, there wasn't a single vid screen anywhere that wasn't projecting some sort of image of what was going on all around campus. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, they set up in a mountainous region just outside of the Mount City. Nobody knew who had called for this. It wasn't something the announcer was going in, and it wasn't anything during the talks previously that anybody had watched. They had just concluded that they wanted to use this area. Everybody was looking as the teams were getting ready. They looked on different channels and seen different images of each side, each of them getting ready, loading up their weapons, making sure everything worked, and making sure they're only using paint, of course. It was a very interesting layout, as neither of them wore a lot. In fact, they didn't wear much of anything. Neither species liked to wear clothing, except for some strange-looking loincloth that Zucknackel started wearing when they came to class. This was confusing to everybody, as you really couldn't tell who or what you were talking to that way, but it was part of their culture, so no one really put up a big deal about it. The rest of it was a simple harness to hold any type of pistols, and of course those shock batons, which were only about 2.25 feet long at best. Yet, being hit by one, you definitely know it. It is almost as bad as being hit with 3 of the stun guns at one time, but not really enough to actually do any real damage. You will get bruised up, but that's usually the worst you get. Looking close, it was clear to Larry that the Zucknackel had learned a little bit. Their outfits were very similar to what the Zucknackel had had before. However, their gear, their LBE, LCE, or whatever the hell you want to call it, their kit, was very human in design. It looks as though they're trying to put everything in a way that almost mimics humans. This was interesting to see, but nothing that really stuck out. As they switched over to another view, they looked at the Arkeytens and they saw that they were set up fairly similar. However, most of what they had was clearly designed by their own folks. It was very broad strapped, however, very strategically placed to allow their wings to move freely. Everyone was confused at this, but they understood that each species is going to go through these challenges their own way. It seemed as though the numbers were very similar, but you never know in some of these cases. A lot of times, some people do hide their numbers, but it's not always the case. Humans, when going through the challenge, they always want to make sure you know the numbers themselves. That way, there's no possibility of cheating. However, it's impossible to cheat with the amount of cameras that's going on everybody, plus the GPS that everyone carries, which is the only electronics they are allowed to carry. As everything got ready, everybody watched as each side got ready. Eventually, the horn sounded. This signified the start, and every single creature that could took flight into the air. The Zucknackel had a difficult time as they would have to get a running start and try to almost glide their way off the edge, where the Arkeytens could actually wave their wings strong enough where they could actually do a vertical takeoff. This looked as though it kind of made the Arkeytens chuckle at the idea. Though it was kind of hard to tell, being a new species, it was difficult to figure out their individual type of movements, things that the gestures would give away. The Arkeytens flew in perfect formation, and everyone noticed how graceful they were and how easily they got in formation. This was truly first and second nature to them, being an avian species as to be expected. As they watched, everybody in the room, from Larry all the way down to the children, noticed that Cindy was getting very uncomfortable. Every time they showed how graceful the Arkeytens were moving, and sometimes how the Zucknackel were able to take flight and glide so easily, she seemed to unconsciously move her wings. It was as though she was embarrassed at the idea that her wings were not big enough to actually fly. They were more decorative than anything else, a way of enhancing her already enhanced form. Hint, hint. As each of the teams flew in close, they began to take pot shots at each other. Since the paint itself doesn't actually work like a bullet, but ballistics are still ballistics, they would try to aim high, trying desperately to actually land a hit. The problem is, at that point, the paintballs themselves, even though they are very well made, would not actually break upon impact, especially against feathers. Feathers worked as a natural barrier, a natural impact barrier to catch the actual paint and not have them actually break. You would have to hit them somewhere on the head or chest, back, or legs for that to happen. Along with that, they looked over at the Zucknackel, and the Zucknackel were very, very thin. Hitting them in the wings was not going to do anything, as it would, just like feathers, absorb the impact itself, and the paintball would simply drop to the ground. After the first volley, the Arkeytens split their forces, and it was obvious what they were doing. The females were much, much lower, and the males were much, much higher. Nobody really understood this until they thought about it for a second. Then they realized they were trying to catch the Zucknackel in the center and hit them from both ends. Larry looked at this and remembered his time back on Earth when he watched hawks hunt, where one would be very low and another would be very high. The one up high would usually squeak, squeal, or in some way, shape, or form call, causing whatever prey to lift themselves up and expose themselves, trying to see where their predator was. And then the other one would simply swoop in very quickly and snag their prey. This put a chill down his spine, thinking about this, yet he still watched. The Zucknackel lost at least one before realizing that they were overwhelmed and withdrawed into the city themselves, trying desperately to weave in and out of the buildings, trying any way, shape, or form to keep from getting hit. But as they turned and flew away, the Arkeytens were hot on their heels. The ones up high used gravity to their advantage and dove in, and were able to catch up to several of the Zucknackel and actually force them to make dangerous turns, along with tagging a few of them on the back, forcing them to claim that they were out and that they immediately would have to land. Unfortunately for the Zucknackel, one of them misjudged the turn and crashed into a building, going right through the wall and into the building itself. They immediately called for a medic to come in and check them out, but as soon as they stood up and said, "I'm okay," they were immediately pelted by paintballs. This got the Arkeytens to believe that they could easily take down the Zucknackel forces, and as they all got low, bunching up, trying to get in close and trying to move in and following the Zucknackel to where they're going to be roosting, as they could only glide and not fly, the Zucknackel called out. And watching this, Larry barely had time to say, "It's a trap!" before multiple windows popped open and Zucknackel came out firing like madmen into the Arkeytens as they went right through the trap itself. It was insane, but the Arkeytens were not out of tricks. They immediately dropped their long guns, grabbed their pistols, and we didn't realize they were on full automatic. And they simply were basically saying, "Surprise, motherfucker," as they began to spray into every window they saw. The Zucknackel were easily firing back, and it was a shot-for-shot hit every single time. The Arkeytens were forced to pull out of the cities, as the rest of the Zucknackels that had pulled away began to dive on them with shock batons of all things. It seemed as though they had dropped their long guns to try and get some sort of air. This made sense as you realized they had to lose as much weight as possible in order to get any type of altitude. As they came down, many crashed into each other, and the fights ended up on the ground. As they did, they fell prey to the Zucknackel snipers, which was their saving grace, of course, as the Arkeytens, knowing more about flight, were able to make sure that the Zucknackel hit the ground first, causing many of them to definitely not want to get back up as they were in so much pain. But as the Arkeytens would raise their shock batons immediately, and they would be tagged either in the leg, the head, or the back, sometimes even the breastbone, which for some reason made them hurt even more. Seemed to be a soft spot, I guess. But this meant that they had fallen into another trap. The Zucknackel had learned. Larry looked over at Gretnar, and she seemed to be a bit concerned at this, that the Zucknackel had adjusted their fighting style so much. Usually, they were one of the worst ones out there. The only ones they could truly beat was the Co. But now they were truly dangerous, as they were putting up a good fight against a far superior enemy. The final two that was out there, one of the lead Artesians, and of course a winged Zucknackel, went at each other. They tried to use the shock batons on each other in flight, but ended up crashing very hard into the ground. So much so that both bodies started flying around, and all anyone could see in the vid screens was blood, feathers, and wings that had been ripped off. This was immediate call for the end of the match as both of them were down. Surprising nobody, the Zucknackel actually won, as they still had personnel on the ground. Since medics were called, Cindy immediately got up and ran out of the room as fast as she could. Larry didn't even think of following her, as he realized that her being a geneticist would be extremely important to see if they could reattach those wings or if they had to grow new ones. Though this was going to be a concern because the Arkeytens had shown no interest in the CRISPR programs being genetically altered at all. though they might rethink this as they just got their ass kicked, and at the cost of a lot. Many of their own people were still on the ground as the medical robots came up to grab as many and lift them up and take them to the medical facility as soon as possible. As they watched some of the bodies being lifted up, others walking around trying to cover up wounds as they bled on the ground, Larry looked over. Sherry was in her mother's arms, almost petrified, one eye watching the screen while she buried herself into her mother's chest. She saw this and was shaking a bit. Her mother was concerned about this, as they had never seen one of these challenges get so bloody. Larry and John were simply stunned watching. John couldn't take his eyes off the screen as his jaw was wide open. Larry had to get up and comfort Sherry a bit, saying, "Don't worry, they'll be fine. We have the best medical folks here. You see those wings? They'll grow back. They'll grow back bigger and better. Don't worry. Don't worry, hon." He stroked her hair, trying to calm her down, and realized that her tail had wrapped fully around his wife's leg, and tight, too. Basically, their version of white knuckling something. She wasn't crying, she was just surprised at this. Gregnar reminded her that this is just the way of the galaxy is large. We would rather have battles in there and a few people get hurt than other things happen, and more people get hurt. Sherry seemed a bit confused at this, but also seemed as though her eyes were starting to contemplate the idea, though she still did not like the violence that she had seen. She worried about all this. John, on the other hand, was still stunned and just was staring at the screen, watching everything as more of the medical machines picked up more and brought them over. He could see some of them were dripping blood, some of them were simply limp. Larry asked him, "Are you going to be okay?" John simply replied, "Yeah, yeah, I'll be good." With that, both Gregnar and Larry realized this was going to be too much. They turned off the vid screens and simply took the kids for ice cream to try and calm them down. Although Larry would have to carry his young daughter, as she was still a bit traumatized at what she saw. However, that trauma didn't last very long as they sat there eating their ice cream, watching the kids try and contemplate what was happening. A few of the Arkeytens actually came and landed. Some of them still had bandages on and seemed to be laughing at the whole thing and simply taking in the loss. Although it was a loss, they did put up a hell of a fight for a while. With that, they went in to get their own mealworm version of ice cream. And John was able to go up and ask them, "Are you guys going to be okay?" They simply looked over and they saw something they couldn't understand. Was that human? Was that forced? What the hell was that? Then they saw Larry stand up next behind his son, and they recognized their instructor. Then they looked down and realized that this was the genetic modification they had heard about. They simply responded that they were going to be just fine. John asked, "Well, what about the one about the wing?" The two Arkeytens got a little quiet. They said they can save it. And with that, they simply turned and walked away. They obviously did not want to think about that. This seemed to be something major in their culture, and Larry realized that he was definitely going to have to bring this up inside one of his classes. Over in the courtyard, as several of the Zucknackel began to land, it seemed as though they were giving themselves their own version of high five, which was slapping their tails together and simply congratulating themselves on their win. They even walked past a couple of the Arkeytens and seemed to not have any seemingly bad blood between them after that. This was surprising, given the way Zucknackel culture is. This just made Larry wonder, with all that's going on, I wonder what's going to happen next.